Welcome, everyone, to the Korea Economic Institute of America. My name is Kyle Ferrier. I'm the Director of Academic Affairs and Research here at KEI. Today's program is part of our academic paper series, through which KEI commissions up to 10 papers each year on various topics related to the U.S.-Korea alliance and the U.S. and South Korea, and invites the authors to come into Washington, D.C. to give presentations at programs like this one, and at the end of the year we collate our papers into our On Korea publication, which is outside before you leave, as well as Marco's paper for today's program. So over the past few months, I'm sure a lot of us have been knee-deep in North Korea with the Trump-Kim summit, and then it being canceled, and then it's coming back on, and now we'll see what happens next week. And then there's been the Xi-Kim summits in between, as well as the Moon-Kim summits as well. So we've had a lot of summitry so far, but if all goes well next week, we may have a lot more to do with North Korea than what we've seen in the past few months. So it's important not to really get North Korea fatigued, but to think strategically about how we think about the North Korea problem and how we think about the North Korean issue. And some of the things that we need to take account for are really under-addressed, which is why our author, Marco Milani, is here today to talk about North Korea's nuclear identity, why they have their nuclear programs beyond just the regime survival aspect that we talk about, and how this should influence diplomatic activity moving forward. So Marco is a lecturer and postdoctoral research fellow at the Korea Studies Institute at USC, and he was previously a fellow at the Department of Political Science and Social Sciences at the University of Bologna. And his full bio can be found in the flyer for today's program. Marco will give an overview of his paper, and then we'll move on to Q&A after that. But I see we have an issue with the PowerPoint. Well, if you wanted to start to introduce yourselves, and we'll figure this out.
All right. And thank you to the Korean Economic Institute for inviting me today, and thank you to all of you for coming here for my presentation. My name is Marco Milani, and I'm a lecturer at the School of International Relations at the University of Southern California. So,
there it is.
All right, so today we're going to talk about the North Korean nuclear program. It's a very interesting topic, especially these days, and what I wanted to today, and what I did in my paper, is try to analyze the evolution of the nuclear program from the perspective of the motivation, why the regime decided to invest so much resources, so much money and energy and political capital in developing nuclear weapons. First of all, the window. All right. First of all, the North Korean nuclear program for sure is a major security concern, not only in East Asia, but for the whole world. When we talk about security in international politics, we can address this concept from different perspectives. Mainly, security can be understood in terms of traditional security or non-traditional security. Traditional security is basically military security. Security studies started in the 50s, more or less, as a discipline, and developed during the years of the Cold War. And during those years, the focus was mostly all the time on military security. Security studies is a discipline that is at the crossroad between military knowledge and social sciences on the other side. But after the end of the Cold War, the concept of security started to change, and new perspective on security started to emerge. That's what we call non-traditional security. But we can start from military security. That is the major perspective through which the North Korean nuclear program has been analyzed over the past years. So in terms of military security, North Korean nuclear program is a concern. Why? Because nuclear weapons are a threat to for the neighboring countries of North Korea, and recently also for the United States, when North Korea developed intercontinental ballistic missiles, for example. Then, the second point of military security is the deterrence equilibrium. The fact that North Korea has developed nuclear weapons is changing the deterrence equilibrium in the region. And the third point is the threat of global non-proliferation. There's a non-proliferation regime based on the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the fact that North Korea developed nuclear weapon is a threat, is a breach of this regime. And potentially, it can also lead to threats of proliferation to other countries around the world. So these are the three main military security concerns. The traditional interpretation of the motivation is based on regime survival. So nuclear program as a guarantee for the survival of the regime from external attacks. That's the point. Survival from military attacks from the outside. It's also to be seen as a response to the hostile post-Cold War international environment. North Korea found itself isolated in a hostile environment after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the communist bloc. So in this perspective, the North Korean nuclear program is understood as a defensive instrument to defend the regime from external military attacks. But there are also other perspectives on this. So if the main goal of the regime is survival, protect the regime, the survival of the regime, then we can see that there are other existential threats for the survival of the regime, not only the ones related to military security. That's here that comes the non-traditional aspects of security. Non-traditional aspects of security that plays a role also for North Korea for the development of the nuclear program. Non-traditional security for the North Korean nuclear program are, for example, economic security. Economic security, we can intend it as aid and assistance on one side, but also the sanctions, because the sanctions regime are an obstacle for economic growth of the country. So they have an impact on the economic security of North Korea. And the other aspect of non-traditional security is the ideological legitimization of the regime with the elite and with the population. These are two different non-traditional aspects of security. So today, in this presentation, we will start with a brief overview of non-traditional security. What is non-traditional security? How it developed? What are these other sectors of security that plays an important role? And regime survival, of course. And then we will go through the evolution of the North Korean nuclear program with some key points, like the first nuclear crisis, the second nuclear crisis, and what happened in recent years. Are we in a third nuclear crisis, or were we in a third nuclear crisis in 2016, 2017, or not? And what are the different aspects of security that play the role? In the first, in the second, in the third? Did something change over the years? Has there been an evolution of the nuclear program, of its motivation, of what happened, okay? And then the last point will be a comprehensive approach to the nuclear program, because if there are many different issues in play, many different levels, then a comprehensive strategy is needed, a strategy that can address all these different levels, not only the military security level. But let's start with security. So the first point is that after the end of the Cold War, there has been a total redefinition of the concept of security in international politics. Why? The main reason is that the Cold War was a sort of meta event for security studies. Security studies developed with the Cold War. And the existence of the Soviet Union as a continuing existential threat for the US, for the Western Bloc, not only in terms of military security, but also in terms of ideological security, because it was an ideological alternative. This was the foundation of security studies. So when relatively peacefully the Cold War ended, this existential threat was not there anymore. So after that, other aspects started to emerge as very important in addition to military security. And the second point is globalization. Globalization enhanced the economic interdependence, the technological interdependence, the ways of communication around the world. And it also had an impact in eroding the role of states as the main actor in international relations and in security. So the combined effect in the early 90s of these two events, end of the Cold War and globalization, led to this redefinition of the concept. So security became a very highly contested concept in international relations after that, okay? Here I put a very broad and probably oversimplified definition of security, but I think that it's very interesting to take a look at that. So security is about survival. That's why when we think about regime survival, we have to think about security. A security threat is an existential threat to a referent object, first important thing. Typically the state, but not only the state, in which the risks that the threat implies justify the use of extraordinary measures. That means there's an existential threat that threatens the existence of the referent object in this case the state. Anytime we have such a threat, an existential threat, we talk about security status in international relations. Of course, the first threat that everybody can think about in international politics is military threat, a military attack from the outside to the state. That's the first point. But there's more to it. Because potentially there are many issues that can destabilize a regime or that can become an existential threat for a state or another referent object, okay? So this revolution in the concept of security led to a widening and deepening of the very concept of security. What do we understand as security? What do states mean when they talk about security? That started to change, okay? And this process was particularly important within the liberal world order that emerged after the end of the Cold War, as the dominant system after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The first point of this widening and broadening of the concept is new issues came. New issues became securitized, became security. Economic issues, human security, migration, environmental security. There are many more examples, drug trafficking. All these issues became security issues because they started to be considered as a threat to the survival of a referent object, in this case, the state. And the other important point of this widening and deepening is that new actors emerged. Not only the state is at the center of security, but also international organizations, NGOs, multinational corporations, societies, and even individuals. Human security is about protecting individuals, okay, not collectivities. So this is a big revolution, and it took place mainly within the liberal world order, the countries integrated in the liberal world order. But this process had consequences also for countries that remained outside this world order, just like North Korea, for example. So for them, the broadening of security was limited to the issues, not the referent object. For them, the referent object to protect was still the state. And in the North Korean case, the regime. That was the point. So no new actors, but new issues emerged. Not only military problems, but also other problems, like economic security, for example, or ideology security, that is also called societal security, but that's the point, okay? So the survival of the state here remains the main priority. There are no new referent objects. It's an horizontal expansion of security, not a vertical expansion of security. Protection for external attacks still remains a priority. Non-traditional security doesn't mean that military security doesn't matter anymore. It's still the priority, but there are also other things with military security. So other sources of instability, okay, related to material aspects, food, energy supplies, for example. That's the most relevant case for North Korea in the 90s, for example, but also non-material ones, like threats to ideologies or collective identities. So in this situation, with this revolution going on in the 90s, also in practical terms, in terms of politics, things changed for North Korea in the same period. So the end of the Cold War left North Korea in a very precarious situation. It was a real shock, not only for military guarantees, because North Korea was under the Soviet nuclear umbrella, so it was relatively safe from external attacks for from 1953 until the end of the Cold War. So Soviet Union was a military guarantee from external attack, but was also the main trade partner, for example, and provider of energy assistance and aid. So North Korea found itself isolated economically, and its dependency from China started to grow in those years, okay? And also problems for the legitimacy of the regime. These problems of the legitimacy of the regime had different sources. One of these sources, for example, was that the regime started to be unable to provide basic goods, especially food, for the people during the famine in the 90s. This undermines the legitimacy of the regime. In the same period, we have the death of Kim Il-sung, the founder of North Korea, and the ultimate depository of the ideology of North Korea, okay? So these different threats to the legitimacy of the regime started to become big problems for the survival. So started to become security problems for the regime itself. So in the early 90s, we can see that the roots of non-traditional security, that is very important today, were already in place. The roots started in those years, in the 1990s. Let's now take a look at the evolution of the nuclear program. So the focus on the development of nuclear weapons is a response to new security challenges, regime survival. During the years of the Cold War, Soviet Union was also a check for the North Korean nuclear program. Why was also a check? First of all, because it provided the nuclear umbrella for North Korea. So in that case, the development of nuclear weapons was not as a priority as it became in the 90s. But the other point is that the Soviet Union was committed to the non-proliferation regime, just like the United States, so they didn't want North Korea to proliferate. For example, in 1985, North Korea signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the Soviet Union pressured North Korea to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The pressure of the Soviet Union was an issue when North Korea decided to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But in the 90s, this situation completely changed, as we just saw. So with the first nuclear crisis, in 1993-1994, North Korea threatened to withdraw from the NPT. In 1993, the negotiation started with the United States. There was some backlashes in the 1993, and then again 1994 negotiations were in place again. And then the agreed framework was signed in October 1994. Why the first nuclear crisis went like this? One of the reasons can be that it was a response to the new international environment, and it followed some lines that were predominantly there during those years in international politics. First of all, the US was the only remaining superpower. And there was a very short period of time in which there was a unipolar balance of power with only one superpower, the United States. And one of the priorities of the United States in those years was to prevent nuclear proliferation around the world. So the fact that North Korea was developing nuclear weapons was a priority for the United States in order to prevent nuclear proliferation. At the same time, the only remaining superpower was an enemy for North Korea. It was a major security threat. North Korea and the United States are still at war today, and were still at war in 1993-1994. So the international environment was very hostile for North Korea. So the United States took, in the first-person negotiation, bilateral negotiation with North Korea, and the two countries reached this agreement, the agreed framework, in 1994, through bilateral negotiation. In the agreed framework, one of the most important parts is, for sure, guarantees about military security, okay? So on one side, North Korea committed to dismantle the existing facilities in Yongbyon based on plutonium, and at the same time, the United States gave official guarantees from external attacks against North Korea, and then they also said that they would have provided 2 light water reactors to North Korea and provide energy supplies during this period in which the light water reactors was built. So in this agreement, military security is the most important thing, and also energy security plays a significant role. Energy security, in this case, is intended as assistance, so providing energy supplies to North Korea from the outside, from the United States, for example, and from this consortium who had to build the international consortium who had to build the 2 light water reactors. These were the 2 most important points. Why? First of all, because military security was the major concern in the 90s. Second, because North Korea in the 90s was going through a period of economic hardship, and they really needed energy supply at the time in form of assistance and aid from the outside. With the second nuclear crisis, things were different. The situation was different both at international level and at domestic level. At the domestic level, North Korea had overcome the worst moment of the crisis, of the famine of the 1990s. Okay, with the second nuclear crisis, we're talking about 2002, 2003. Kim Jong-il had consolidated his power, his grip on power, and his legitimacy inside the country. He launched a new political line called jong-un, or military first policy. He revised the constitution in 1998. He gave more power to the military instead of the party, especially through the National Defense Commission. So his power was much stronger than it was in the years before. At the international level, the unipolar era was quickly disappearing. And in the region, China was emerging as a critical actor in every aspect of security, but specifically with North Korea. Because the dependency of North Korea from China was growing, and China started to play a significant role in the issue. At the same time, the United States was rebalancing its strategic priorities toward the Middle East and Central Asia, and away from East Asia during the so-called war on terror. So the situation was different when the second nuclear crisis erupted. And also the way to address the second nuclear crisis was different, because it was addressed through the so-called six-party talks. So a multilateral framework of negotiation, not a bilateral negotiation between US and North Korea. In this case, critical actors were part of the framework, especially China and South Korea, but also Russia and Japan, the six parties. Within the framework of the six-party talks, the aspects of non-traditional security started to emerge more than in the past, especially in terms of economic aid and assistance. Okay? This is clear if we take a look at the two most important documents that came out of six-party talks, the joint statement of September 2005 and the other statement of February 2007, initial steps to implement the 2005 joint statement. There were the traditional security guarantee, the military security guarantee were still in place, because this is still a priority. As I told at the beginning, non-traditional security doesn't mean that military security is not an issue anymore. It's still a priority, so the traditional security was still there. But there were also other points that addressed other issues, like, for example, economic and energy security. So this is taken from the 2005 declaration. The six-party talks undertook to promote economic cooperation in the fields of energy, trade, and investment, bilaterally and or multilaterally. Here, we can also see another important thing, that it became much more important over the years, and is very important today. The concept of economic cooperation. Economic security is not only about providing aid and assistance to a poor country. It's also about economic development. And economic cooperation can lead to economic development for a country, much more than aid and assistance. So when we think about economic security, we don't have to think only about concessions to the North Korean regime of food supplies, energy supplies, and things like that. But we also have to think about other kind of economic engagement, like economic cooperation, bilateral or multilateral, like trade, investment, all the things that were listed in this declaration. So the nuclear program in those years started to be used also to obtain benefits for the economic development of the country. So that's another level. Military security, and then we add another level, that is economic development, economic security. Why in those years? There are different reasons. For me, there are mainly three reasons. The first reason is the increasing inter-Korean economic cooperation. And I think that's a very important point, because although inter-Korean relations and the North Korean nuclear program are two different things, the fact that inter-Korean cooperation was in place during those years led to the possibility of a growth in economic cooperation, not only with South Korea, but also with other countries in the region, like China, Russia, for example. The second point is that in 2006, North Korea tested a nuclear weapon for the first time. And the fact that they showed to the world that they were capable of that gave power, negotiating power, to North Korea. And then the third point, I think, is the most important point, because after the test, the United Nations Security Council imposed sanctions on North Korea with the Resolution 1718. It's just the first of a long series of UNSC resolutions against North Korea, against the North Korean nuclear program. And all these resolutions are focused mainly on economic aspects. That's important because, as I said before, economic development is just not aid and assistance. And economic sanctions started to be a great obstacle for the economic development of the country. So economic sanctions introduced this new aspect of economic security, that is, the cooperation. So the 2006 test had played different factor in this process. On one side, strengthened the position of North Korea, the negotiating position, but on the other side, it started this process of sanctioning of the country for the nuclear program, creating an obstacle for the economic development of the country. Non-traditional security concerns became finally crucial under Kim Jong-un. Not only the economic part, but also the ideological part, okay? In terms of economic security, the international sanctions, as I just told, started in 2006, and then there were new economic sanctions in 2009 and 2013 with the second and third nuclear tests. And then we have a long list of sanctions, okay? This regime of sanctions has tightened up over the years, and this started to become a big problem for the regime. At the same time, when Kim Jong-un took power in 2011, the inter-Korean cooperation was highly reduced under the President Kim Yong-bak in South Korea, especially after the May 24 measures in 2010. So these were issues for Kim Jong-un in terms of economic security, but also in terms of ideological legitimization, there were issues when he took power. First of all, he was relatively unexperienced and unknown in the country. He was very young. He had a very different path compared to his father, Kim Jong-il, who worked with his father, Kim Il-sung, for decades before taking power in 1994. So Kim Jong-un did not have all this time, so his position was weaker within the country. Okay? He was unknown for the population and had a weaker position within the leadership, the elite of the regime. So the nuclear program started to be also a means to consolidate his power domestically. And this was very clear right from, right from the beginning, okay? Kim Jong-un took power after Kim Jong-il died in December 2011. In 2012, the North Korean regime amended the constitution and proclaimed the country a nuclear state in the preamble of the constitution. This revision of the constitution introduced also other aspects. For example, the importance of Kim Jong-il and his ideology was inserted in the preamble of the constitution. This is very important because in the constitution, the basic law of every single country in the world, being a democracy or an autocracy, in the most important law of the country, in the preamble, states that North Korea is a nuclear state. And that's a big thing in terms of national identity ideology. In 2013, Kim Jong-un called for the adoption of the so-called Pyongyang line. This is the parallel development of nuclear weapons on one side and economic development of the country on the other side. So this became his policy line. And the nuclear weapons became the first pillar of the official new policy line of the new leader. That's something very important. That's the first pillar. There's also the second pillar that is very important too. A lot of people sometimes forget about that, but the Pyongyang is based on two pillars: nuclear weapons, economic development. Okay? But if we focus now on the nuclear weapons, we can see that it became crucial for the identity of the regime and the ideology of the regime in this period. The following day, April 1st, 2013, the Supreme People's Assembly approved a law on the possession of nuclear weapons. The first official law on the possession of nuclear weapons of North Korea for self-defense. When Kim Jong-un launched Pyongyang and when the Supreme Assembly approved this law, there was an emphasis all the time on the defensive character of the nuclear weapons. Well, nuclear weapons are for self-defense, okay? And North Korea will be a responsible nuclear power in the international community. That is very important, even if we don't believe that they will use it only for self-defense, that is a defensive instrument, that's still very important. Because this is a clear signal of the fact that North Korea wanted to be accepted as a nuclear power. They started to play the part of the responsible nuclear power. There are other countries in the world nuclear power outside the NPT. And even if they are not officially recognized inside the NPT, they have relations with every other country in the world, for example. They have nuclear cooperation with the United States, if we think about India, for example. So of course, we cannot make a straight comparison between India and North Korea. But all these things signals the fact that North Korea wanted to be accepted as a nuclear power. So the regime included the nuclear power status in its ideology, in its national identity, in the very identity of the regime. This can be seen as an institutionalization process of the North Korean nuclear program. The nuclear programs are to be introduced in the institutions of the country through laws, okay? And this institutionalization was aimed at consolidating the legitimacy of the new leadership. Okay? So we have military security still there. We have economic security that started to emerge with the second nuclear crisis, and with the third nuclear crisis, or let's say under Kim Jong-un, became even more important because Pyongyang line and the emphasis on economic development. And then now we have this third very important part, that is the identity of the regime, the ideological legitimization of the regime. Okay? The regime is there to protect the country, and nuclear weapons are the most important means to defend the country, and also the most cost-effective means to defend the country compared to conventional weapons. Okay? That was a very important point. This was, of course, introduced in the ideology of the regime that is still based on the idea of Juche, self-reliance, and then Kim Jong-il introduced the Song-un military first policy, and then Kim Jong-un introduced the Pyongyang line, the parallel development. Okay? These are not mutually exclusive. They are still there, all these different ideologies, or the big ideology and then the different political lines of the people. But this emphasis of the nuclear program had also practical effects. It's a very clear chart that explains how much Kim Jong-un invested in the nuclear program. This is just like an example. These are all the missile nuclear tests under Kim Il-sung, under Kim Jong-il, and under Kim Jong-un. So we can see a big rise after Kim Jong-un took power. So it took also, not only in terms of ideology of laws and political line, but it really took practical steps in order to achieve his goal of developing nuclear weapons. And this is just a list. I mean, I'm sure that all of you are well aware of what happened. This is just a list of the most important points, of the most important tests of the past 2 years. There's much more than that. This is just a list of the nuclear tests, the fourth in January 2016, and then September 2016, and then again September 2017. And then the ICBM tests, 2 in July and 1 in November. So just a short list of what Kim Jong-un achieved in terms of nuclear and missile power in such a short time. So after the ICBM test in November, last November 2017, the regime declared that North Korea had achieved the status of nuclear power. And this concept was reiterated by Kim Jong-un himself in the New Year's Day speech on January 1st, 2018. That's a very important point because it explains different things. For example, one thing is that the intended audience of these tests and of this declaration is not only the international community, but it's also a domestic audience, North Korea elite and population. It's the leader saying we achieved the first pillar of my new policy line. That's a very big tool of legitimization within the country. Okay. On the other side, there's also, of course, an international audience for this. And together with these new announcements of having achieved the status of nuclear power in the New Year's Day speech, Kim Jong-un also started to open toward other countries and started this diplomatic offensive that is still going on today. He started opening toward South Korea with the Olympic offensive, Olympic relations, North Korea participating in the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, February this year. And then he proposed a meeting with Moon Jae-in And then, for example, the president of the International Olympic Committee visited North Korea in March and met with Kim Jong-un. Kim Jong-un met Xi Jinping twice in April and May. And then he also met the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. And he met, of course, Moon Jae-in twice. And then probably next week he will meet also President Trump. Why those two things are connected? These two things are connected probably also because after having achieved the first pillar, now the regime is moving toward the second pillar of the Pyongyang line. That is the economic development. So North Korea wants to be recognized as a nuclear power in some way in the international community, but it also wants to enhance the economic development, the growth of the country. And the sanctions are a big problem for that. So this diplomatic offensive probably comes after the regime decided that they have achieved the first pillar and then they want to focus on the second one. Okay? Military security, economic security, ideological security, they're all connected also here. So the survival of the regime is not only connected to the attack, military attack from the outside, but also they're connected to the domestic stability of the leadership and the economic development. These 2 points are very important and must be taken into consideration. A comprehensive approach. A comprehensive approach has to take into account these two non-traditional aspects of security. So 3 levels: military security, economic security, ideology security. These are the 3 big aspects that a comprehensive approach to the nuclear program has to take into account. As for traditional security, that's the most straightforward part. The threat is the military attack from the United States with nuclear or conventional weapons. So one thing is a formal reassurance regarding conventional nuclear attacks. One thing that has to be in negotiation is a formal reassurance for North Korea. And also another thing that might be useful in this negotiation are military confidence building measures. There are many different ways of implementing military confidence building measures. In the past, the North Korean regime had a very strong idea, a very hard idea of that. They wanted the United States and South Korea to stop joint military exercises and the US troops to withdraw from South Korea. That's a very big request. But today it seems that the regime is not asking for this any longer. So one military confidence building measure, for example, would be to reduce the joint military exercise, for example. In the same traditional security perspective, we can also think about the possible peace treaty to formally end the Korean War. This point was also mentioned in the Panmunjom Declaration in April after the meeting between Kim Jong-un and Moon Jae-in. And as a last point, of course, the normalization of diplomatic relations between North Korea and the United States. But this will be like the very ending point. Before that, formal reassurance and confidence building measure can help for what concerns military security threat for the regime. And then we have the other 2 aspects: economic security and domestic legitimization. For what concerns economic security, I think that the point here is to focus on what economic development is, because this is the second pillar of Pyongyang. To turn the country into a prosperous country, a rich country, okay? So economic development is not assistance and aid. With the quid pro quo logic also of the agreed framework, and even more of the 6-party talks, so concessions, so the regime do something and then the international community gives something in return in terms of aid and assistance. Economic development is different, because for economic development what is needed is economic and trade cooperation and investments. These are the key to achieve the goal of prosperity, that is the second pillar of Pyongyang. In order to do this, North Korea need the sanctions to be lifted, okay? So the idea of gradually lifting the sanctions, introducing cooperation, and integrating North Korea into the regional system can lead to economic development for the country. Okay? This point is strongly connected to the last point, the domestic legitimacy. Because economic cooperation should not destabilize the regime. If we think of economic cooperation like North Korea suddenly opening up the borders and massive amount of foreign investments going to North Korea, that will be another security threat for the regime, because this will destabilize the political security of the regime. So that is not the way forward, okay? This is why implementing these measures gradually is key. And the other key point is that the regime has to control this process, because the regime needs to control what's going on to support their legitimacy and the control over the society. That's a very important point. At the same time, negotiation has to give North Korea, the regime, time to find a functional equivalent in terms of domestic legitimacy. Because if you say we are a nuclear power, and then the international community doesn't want you to be a nuclear power, so you have to say, okay, we are not a nuclear power anymore. You have to find a functional equivalent to support the reason why the regime is there. Is there self-defense? The regime is the only possibility to defend the country from outside, or not? So a functional equivalent in this case can be economic prosperity, for example. That can be an alternative, okay? And this alternative is already there within the policy line, the Pyongyang, okay? But of course, the regime needs time to reframe differently the policy line without the focus on the nuclear program and with a new focus on economic prosperity and development. So for this, probably a negotiation that will lead to freezing North Korean nuclear capabilities and to prevent proliferation from North Korea to other countries can be a good initial step, instead of asking the CVID, the complete verifiable irreversible dismantlement of the nuclear program. Okay? So for the first stage, focusing on freezing North Korean nuclear capabilities, no more tests, no more production of weapons, and prevent proliferation. In this way, the international community can give the regime breathing space, operating space, to reframe the ideological framework and to find a functional equivalent, like, for example, economic prosperity. So, time? Okay. Oh, I finished. All right, so, a comprehensive strategy, in my opinion, has to address all these three different levels. It's not only about military security, it's not only about nuclear weapons to protect the country against an attack from the United States, but there are also other levels in play. In this case, we saw the economy and the ideology. These two levels are in play with the North Korean nuclear program. And in a negotiation process aimed at limiting or eliminating this nuclear threat, these two levels must be taken into account in some way. And in order to do this, I think that the key word for negotiation must be flexibility from both sides. Flexibilities on one side, and also trying to combine on one side the international imperatives of non-proliferation, stability of the region. But on the other side, must be taken into account also the domestic imperatives of the North Korean regime. Because for the regime, for the stability of the regime and the survival of the regime, domestic imperatives are as important as international imperatives. Thank you.
Thanks for that great presentation, which is actually a really great overview of your paper. In the paper itself, I know we talk a lot about, some people have talked about ideology being important to consider, and some others have talked about the need to leverage the nuclear program to gain economic concessions, but I don't think anyone's done it in such a very comprehensive framework and done it in a way that has given each side justice. So I think this is a really good addition to the literature. So I'm going to ask a couple questions, and I'm going to put on my skeptical hat. just to balance things out here a little bit, and to use your framework that you had talked about, looking at the domestic side of things and the international side of things. That's how I'm going to focus the question. So on the domestic side, for North Korea, a lot of this, a lot of what you're talking about involves a degree of trust in the DPRK, and that we should trust them to give them the space that they need to enact the change. And then before, we've looked at different things within the North Korean state and said, okay, well, here's some signs of change, and we've made decisions on that before, and we've gotten things haven't gone the way that we've expected them to go based off of those indicators that we have looked at. So if we are to get burned again, say we follow through on this on sort of incorporating your framework into addressing the North Koreans in negotiations, what would your advice be to negotiators? Should we try and reevaluate the playbook, or is this what we need to stick to and we just have to play the long game, more or less? Mm-hmm. And then on the international side of things, for you before you talked about different international factors involving the North Korean nuclear crises and how it moved from bilateral to a multilateral step into six-party talks, and it may look like if the trend continues, that the summits may be the next forum that moves the diplomatic momentum on the North Korea nuclear crisis, for better or for worse. So, in your opinion, is this a good diplomatic forum? I know you're not a diplomacy scholar, but in terms of your knowledge of the issue, can these forums be a good use to actually push through the issues that you're talking about?
Regarding the first question, you're right. Things like that happen in the past in some way. I think that this time is different for a couple of reasons. First of all, I don't underestimate the fact that the regime announced we have reached the status of nuclear power. And that's something that never happened before. And for them to say that clearly, I think that changes the situation today. And not get burned again, I think that the point in this case will be to change the logic from a quid pro quo logic of concessions to a different framework in which you try to cooperate with North Korea, integrate North Korea, and gradually try to build trust between the parties. I don't think that the six-party talks was based on trust. The six-party talks was based on quid pro quo. That's the point of actions for actions. I give you something only if you give me something back. And we go on with little steps like this. Trust building is a little different, in my opinion. It starts from science, for example, and then it builds on it. And while you start building trust, then you can address increasingly important issues. So I think that the framework has to be changed and not based on quid pro quo concessions to the country, to North Korea, but with a different framework, more comprehensive maybe. So we want more now and based more on science. And the fact that North Korea did something, I know that in practical, technical terms, the fact that they closed the Pyongyang site, or the fact that they announced they will not do any other missile or nuclear test, in practical terms, is not a big thing, and it can reverse easily. They can do something secretly, that's for sure. But it's a signal that they sent to the international community and to the elite. So I think that to not get burned again, change the framework based this time on trust building and on cooperation and integration, more than on concessions and quid pro quo logic. And for the summits, well, I'm not a big fan of the six-party talks, so I think that this can be a different approach and this can work better. I'm not sure what's going to happen next Tuesday about that, but for the summits with the South Korean president, I think that they were a very good thing. Because if you sit down and start talking with the other leader, that's a trust-building measure. That's one of the most important trust-building measures. I'm not saying that relying on the personal connections between two leaders or the personality is the base of diplomacy. But trust building is based also on these kind of things. So I think that this new format can be, I don't know if it's going to solve the issue, but my opinion is going to be better than the six-part talks format, that's for sure.
I know I have other questions, but we have a little bit more than a half hour, so I'm just going to turn things over now to the audience. I see some hands already. We have a couple of mics floating around. If you can please state your name and your affiliation before asking your question. We'll go, I'll take the first two hands I saw, one and then two.
I'm Peter Humphrey, Intel analyst and a former diplomat. Skepticism part two. The program can always be hidden in whole or in part in any of the 800 tunnels in the country or within the prison camps. And that means inspection is completely off the table right now and will remain so forever. So unless you're drinking happy juice, this is not going to happen. It's important to realize that every time another year goes by, we are in the crosshairs of whatever project he will arrive at, although he's not there yet. And another 25,000 or so will die in his prison camps. And Trump will not allow this to fall until his second term. He will try and sew this up or react in some way before this term is over. Toward the question. I have to be a little careful here, but there's a couple reasons why North Korea is not a threat now. One is it doesn't have a very good idea of the accuracy of its missiles. So you try for Pearl Harbor and you hit Maui instead. Two, it has a very poor idea of how to get the missile to tell the nuclear weapon to go off at the right altitude to achieve the desired effect. And three, we have zero indication that it has the ceramic nose cones necessary for successful reentry. There's actually a 4 and 5, but I won't go into that. So North Korea thus is a nuclear energy power, but unless it uses a dirigible as a delivery system, it is not a nuclear weapons power. The question, finally, why would North Korea stop at the 96% success level when it is 4% short of actually creating a weapon that could harm us or our allies? What is that about?
Well, I don't have an answer for that because I'm not part of the regime, so I can only think about it. And my point is that the interesting part of the fact that they announced we are a nuclear power state is that the international community is not sure about that. We don't know, as you pointed out, if they have all the technology for the re-entry and all these kind of things. But they announced we are a nuclear weapon state because I think that they evaluate more the fact that they can declare it than the fact that they can actually do it. So I'm not completely sure that they need a reliable system to attack the United States to keep a deterrence equilibrium in place, because they have leverage in military terms on South Korea and Japan, for example, are close allies of the United States. So the only thing that I can think about is what can stop them from achieving like 100%, now they are 96%. The only thing is that, do we really need it or not? Because I don't think that the regime is evil and they do that because they want to counter the international community in general, or they are a revisionist power that wants to overthrow the existing world order. I don't think so. I think that they do that for regime survival. So if they don't need that for regime survival, I don't think that they need to go towards this 100%, risking what they're risking, because there are risks in achieving this 100%. More sanctions, military retaliation from the United States with preemptive attacks, for example. So there are risks in this strategy of achieving the 100% of attacking the United States. So for me, the only reason that can prevent that is that if they have no motivation to do that. they had two pillars, nuclear power and economic development. They declared we achieved the first one. So if now they can keep what they have, at least for now, and find a way to start to develop gradually the economy, I'm not sure that they will need to achieve this 100%. That's the only reason I can think about.
So it's blackness. It's pure and simple blackness.
Yeah, you can say like blackmailing the international community, but it's not only about that. I mean, I think that Kim Jong-un really needed this for strengthening its position also domestically. And for the international community, they're trying to get something from them now. Something, but I don't think this time is not energy supplies or food. It's something different, because prosperity doesn't come from a ship full of rice or oil, I think. I mean, that's my interpretation.
Dan Lieberman, I'm a writer. Chief, let me thank you very much and commend you on an excellent analysis of the situation. Now, if it was U.S. policy to bring stability, prevent nuclear proliferation to the Korean Peninsula, it's obvious that it's failed. It's accomplished exactly opposite of what the U.S. intended. So I wonder if that was really the U.S. objectives, because if you look at this with a real jaundiced eye, it's in the interest of the U.S. to have instability on the Korean Peninsula. It allows U.S. troops to be stationed there as an antidote to China and missile defenses, and all prevents a unification of the Koreans, which would be an economic powerhouse and really threaten the economic interests of the United States. So I'm wondering if the Koreans really misinterpreted the U.S. objectives. That's the first question. And two, if now they do understand it, and behind the scenes, together with China, they're coming to their own agreement. And this meeting with Trump is only window dressing to only appease the United States and Japan.
Well, I think that's a very interesting interpretation, and yeah, makes sense. I mean, the North Korea, more than instability in the region, the existence of a threat is a very good reason to keep U.S. troops in the area, for example, okay? And once you have the troops there, you can say that it's for North Korea. You don't have to say that we keep troops there because of China. So North Korea, in that interpretation, it's a good thing, the North Korean nuclear program for the U.S. strategy. I'm not sure about that, but this is certainly a very interesting interpretation. And as for China, I think that China is now trying to play a fundamental role again, but was a little bit cut out in the first part of this diplomatic offensive of North Korea that tried to address directly South Korea, the U.S., and of course, Kim Jong-un met with Xi Jinping twice. And after the second meeting, the regime changed a little bit its rhetoric on the summit and all these kind of things. I don't know if the two things are connected. But one thing for sure is that North Korea stopped asking for stopping military exercise and stopped asking for the withdrawal of American troops. And I think that this is not in China's interest, that North Korea stop asking these things. Because for China it's important if the US and South Korea stop joint military exercise, and even more if the US withdraw the troops from the peninsula. I remember the Chinese foreign minister talking about the strategy of the double freeze, so freezing the nuclear tests and freezing the joint military exercises like 1 month ago. North Korea was not asking anymore the double freeze. North Korea was already over the double freeze, but China was still asking for that. Because China has an interest in that, in stopping the joint military exercising, and also possibly withdrawing the troops. So I think that China now is playing a role again. And in some way, they're trying to introduce their own national interest into this negotiation, and indirectly, of course.
Steve Winters, independent consultant. Thank you so much for the talk. It's such a complicated situation, but I thought I'd bring one aspect possible aspect up and see what you thought about it, which has not been widely discussed, although it was mentioned at a meeting here just a few weeks ago at KEI, which is essentially you've got, say, the World Development Organizations, or what do you call World Bank, so forth, on IMF, European groups. These people are getting really excited about the idea of the opening of North Korea. I mean, this is a big, I don't know what the last big opening was, but I mean, the point is you have a country with tremendous resources, rare earths, totally undeveloped. I mean, a young, vibrant population, smart people, hard workers, blah, blah, blah. Bottom line, there's a lot of money to be made on the development of North Korea. I mean, this is not some, and even the, so when people talk about, Trump's going to get together and, you know, with the leader, what are the pressures, who's demanding what? I think there's probably, this is what I'm asking your take on this, there's probably a lot of pressure coming from extremely influential, extremely well-placed individuals who see the potential of how they can make money off this. And if you go up to the Russian side, it's the same thing. I mean, Putin has already said he wants to build this economic corridor going right down there through North Korea, down through South Korea, blah, blah, blah. So they have their own vision, and of course Lavrov was there. So I'm just, people worry about the pressures. You know, does Trump want to show that he's the great deal maker and come out with a deal at any cost? But how about this economic pressure, which nobody talks about, but I think is massive behind the scenes right now? And also the chaebols in South Korea. I mean, they're going to make a fortune on this deal if it opens up.
That's certainly an issue. I mean, I don't know about the U.S. because in case of a new start of economic cooperation, there will be, I think, South Korean and Chinese companies that will be at the forefront. I don't know about the U.S. I don't know how it's going to work. Also because I think that in South Korea and China will have to spend much less political capital on dealing in making money with North Korea, because in the U.S. it's still like a much bigger issue. Just think about the human rights problem, for example. We can think that trying to solve the North Korean nuclear program will suddenly solve also the human rights program. And this is a great tragedy in North Korea. And in this perspective, I think that China and South Korea and also Russia are in a much better position for that. But there are money to be made, that's for sure. That's for sure. And South Korean companies made money in Kaesong, and there's a whole economy on the border between China and North Korea. So, and it's important, even if it's not important for Chinese economy as a whole, it's very important for the regions, Chinese regions at the border with North Korea. So I think that economy will play a massive role, a big role in this. Rosa?
Hi, my name is Rosa Park. I'm with the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. I'd like to get your thoughts on two historical precedents. The first was in 2006 when the Israelis bombed a nuclear reactor in Syria that was built by the North Koreans. What are your thoughts on that? What effects do you think that'll have on this trust-building measure that you are talking about? The second historical precedent I'd like to hear your thoughts on is Orascom. Orascom invested greatly in North Korea's cell phone service. They built the infrastructure. There are now millions of cell phones in North Korea, but then they got kicked out. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, for the first point, I think that it would be easier to control nuclear proliferation if that was the point about the Syrian reactor. I mean, yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. My point is that it would be easier to control this kind of proliferation with the more integrated North Korea than with the more isolated North Korea. Because if you try to integrate the North Korean economy in the region, for example, and North Korea being part of more international organization, that might be easier to control nuclear proliferation. Because isolating countries, the so-called pariah state, the countries that remained outside the world liberal order, basically, they started to make business together. They needed money, they needed diplomatic recognition. And they were all outside the circle, okay? So I think that a good point will be to include North Korea through cooperation and integration. And this would help preventing nuclear proliferation, more than isolating more the country, okay? And of course, in 2006, they were probably not respecting the spirit of the six-party talks, selling nuclear technologies to Syria. But in order to avoid this happening again, I think that the way forward is more integration and cooperation, not more isolation. That's my point. And for Orascom, I think this is the problem with like any single authoritarian country in the world. When you make investment there are more risks. That's for sure, because the rule of law as we know it doesn't apply, because you cannot rely on international bodies like arbitration courts and things like that. So I don't really know how to limit those risks for the companies that want to make money, want to cooperate, not make money, cooperate with North Korea. But that's the risk that every single company has in every single authoritarian country in the world, not only with North Korea. And as long as they think that the gains are more than the costs, or the possible gains are more than the possible costs, they will invest.
So I want to actually follow up on that, because I wanted to ask that question earlier, but I thought it'd be good to open up the floor beforehand. But just to step back a little bit, a lot of what you're talking about, this trust building first, is really some sort of variation of the Sunshine Policy. And that's where it was building trust first, and then something would come afterwards, and it didn't. And obviously, you've brought up different suggestions as to why that couldn't be. But I mean, it is a real risk, and it seems as if companies, for some reason, don't understand what the real risks of investing in North Korea are at this point. I mean, Orascom has, I think, over like $500 million stuck in North Korea, and I wish it could exit the market, but it can't. Hyundai Asan has lost a ton of money, and it's just still sitting.
Well, not an economic
right,
goal.
But I think that there's this sense of that the governments the South Korean governments or the U.S. government will underwrite the risk. They'll have all these companies there, and you have this instance where you open up the economy to wider economic investment, and then the North Koreans shut the door again, and then you build up all of this fervor for economic investment, and people are just blind to the risks, and you give the state a lot more of what it wants, so it can achieve the economic growth that it wants by all this investment without having to deal with the being an actual replacing the ideologically replacing the nuclear program as an ideological replacement. So it's essentially they can have their cake and eat it too. So I just want to give you that scenario and see what you think.
Okay, let's start with this. Let's think about Kaesong. I'm a big fan of Kaesong, and I know that nobody is, so I'm kind of a black sheep in general. But I'm a big fan of Kaesong. Kaesong worked until February 2016, when the South Korean government decided that they didn't want to put money in this project anymore. Because according to sources of the South Korean government, this money were going to the nuclear program. That was the official reason for closing Kaesong. Okay? But until the South Korean government closed the park continued to work. So my point is, I don't think that they can just steal money, steal investment, and then close the door, keep what they have, and do it without the multinational, international companies that have invested in that. As long as it benefits the regime first and the population with the economic growth and prosperity, I don't think they have an incentive to do that. And I'm thinking of other countries. I don't like to make comparison because every single country is different. But if you think, like, for example, Vietnam, started this process like 30 years ago with Doi Moi course and everything. And they built on that. And there was a risk in the 80s of investing in Vietnam, of course. But it worked for the companies, it worked for the regime, it worked for the population. So they had no reason to do that. So I think, I'm not an expert of international political economy, things like that. But I think that as long as there's an incentive from both sides to keep on doing the business, the government has no reason to shut down the door or keep people outside. And I mean, as long as there's an incentive, not only an economic incentives, but here the destabilization of the regime is crucial, as long as the regime can control it. Because if the regime feels threatened by opening up, by foreign investments, this is a reason why they can close it. That's for sure. But if they can control it, like happened in the past in other countries, I think that they have no incentives on that. That's my position. Sure.
Troy Saron here at KI. I'd like to go back to your framework and sort of, I know you said earlier you're not in the regime, but I mean, if we're going to use the framework, I'd like to try and sort of explain something. So I agree that there's three components, military security, economic security, and domestic legitimacy. But looking at it through this way, my question would be, and what I think hasn't made a lot of sense is, from a military security standpoint, by the time we get to, say, early 2016, which is when this current phase kind of really kicked off with the first nuclear test, the shutting of Kaesong and all the other things, you had a situation to where North Korea, we can debate how good the weapons program was, but they had a latent nuclear weapons program. They likely had the ability to take and hit South Korea and Japan, so they had defensive measures. The medium-range missiles and everything largely worked. They might have still needed maybe a few tests, but those tests wouldn't have necessarily precipitated massive sanctions because other than the recent ICBM tests, if you look at the history of the UN sanctions, they're all tied to the nuclear tests, not the actual missile tests. So he could have still done missile tests. So if we look at this then from a perspective of economic security, you need to do the other side of the Pyongyang coin. He needs to grow the economy. Well, in 2016, it grew, I think it was like 4%. So the economy is growing. He has somewhat of a nuclear deterrent. My question then would be not the question that was asked earlier of why stop at 4%, but why push ahead further? Why not? You've already declared yourself in the Constitution a nuclear power state. The sanctions at this point aren't really a problem. There's enough on that you can still control the economy, but it's not so much that you can't do business around the world in a lot of different areas. Coal was still able to be shipped to China, all these other things. So my question is, you're arguing now, okay, he wants to eventually replace domestic legitimacy with economic growth. Why not have done that then? Already say, you know what, we've got all the nuclear program we need. We're going to do this, avoid the UN sanctions, avoid all of this, just build the economy up. So why did they make the strategic choice to get to, we'll say, 96% 2 years ago, rather than to take, and we'll say, get to 96% of what they wanted on the econ side instead?
Well, I think that the reason why they're doing this now is that they really needed to get to the 96% first. That's why I think they couldn't focus on the economic development aspect before. And for military reasons, that's for sure, because the problem is that sometimes when I talk about non-traditional security, the message is that military security is not important. Because if you introduce other issues, then it kind of fade away. But military security is still the most important thing. So my opinion is that they needed to get sure on that and have the 96%. And while doing that, strengthening Kim Jong-un's position within the regime. And that's true that the economy was growing. It's true. But I think that the sanctions, my opinion is that the sanctions cannot strangle the regime to death. Cannot lead to the collapse of the regime. The regime, as demonstrated in the past, they can live through hardship, especially in the 90s. But with the sanctions, you cannot have economic development.
Let me maybe reframe it then, because I guess my point would be is that, Kyle used the phrase "have his cake and eat it too." At that point, he could have had nuclear weapons. No one would have ever taken them away or pushed necessarily. We might have time tried to, and he could have done the economic development, because the sanctions at that point, to be honest, didn't really cover that much at the end of the day. A lot of the financial stuff, we hadn't declared them 311 yet. You could still export most goods. So if your goal is to have real military security, because hitting the United States with a nuclear weapon most likely is the way you ensure the end of your regime.
Of course.
But hitting South Korea and Japan, then you get into the argument that, the Koreans and the Japanese might have about separation. We're vulnerable, but you're not. So in some ways, strategically, I think it made more sense for him to pocket a lesser nuclear capability and build the economy rather than to go here. So that's kind of why within your framework, I'm asking the question.
Okay. Yeah. I got it now. Yeah. Well, I think that this has to do a lot with the domestic legitimacy, because Kim Jong-un used the 2016-17 tests for domestic purposes, and we were still in the process of consolidation, because I think that until the 7th Congress, there was still a very difficult process of consolidation of power within. So I think that one of the reasons might be that he used the nuclear weapons program also for domestic consolidation. But it probably made more sense for him, I don't know. In terms of economic development, well, I'm not so sure, because the situation in 2015, 2014, well, probably they could achieve some kind of economic growth also with the sanctions in place, but there was no inter-Korean cooperation. That might be a good thing. I don't know, but that's a very interesting point of view. Yeah.
Linnea Logie, I'm an intern here at KEI. I thought you had a really interesting and insightful overview of the complexities of the program, and I'm wondering, I think that there's some seeming kind of conflicts with the recommendations for the comprehensive kind of framework for dismantling it, just in the sense that, for me, it's kind of a struggle where, in terms of promoting economic development as sort of an off-route from the nuclear program, it seems to me that there's pretty severe limits in terms of the number of avenues the regime can really go down in terms of opening up its economy while still surviving, because that kind of brings out inherent instability in the regime. And how do you really go about convincing the leadership that you can integrate without then reunifying, which obviously they are keen on avoiding? So to me, I'm just wondering, even though I think it sounds like a compelling option for the international community to pursue, it just seems that it would be very difficult to convince the regime that that's really possible without becoming absorbed or something like that.
Well, there are a lot of problematics in this framework. I mean, I didn't want to present a solution. I was just thinking about, if you want to solve the nuclear threat, you have to take into consideration all the reasons why we have a nuclear threat today. And that's why I introduced these two different levels. Because the point of this negotiation is reducing or eliminating the nuclear threat, not everything else. Not reunification, not regime change, not improving the condition of human rights in North Korea. That's not about that. And let's be very clear, I think, the fact that the international community is dealing with this issue now. Your point is very interesting and very important. The only thing, the point is that I think that it can be done because other regimes managed to do that, to let some degree of international cooperation in economic terms on investments and keep the stability of the regime. So I think that it's something that is achievable for the regime. I don't think that cooperating with other countries will lead to destabilization for sure. So I think there's a way for the regime to control this process of economic cooperation. Because in the past, other authoritarian regimes did that. So I think that it's an option for them. And this might be the only reason to convince them. But if I think also that the international community doesn't have to convince North Korea about that, because I think that they are already thinking about some kind of improving in some way international cooperation in trade and economic cooperation, not with the United States maybe, but with other countries, because this is what sanctions are about. And I'm sure that limiting or eliminating the sanctions is one of the goals of the regime. And limiting or eliminating the sanctions will lead directly to more trade and more investment. More trade for sure, maybe more investments. Maybe not with the United States, but China is there and is ready. And it's like in the past few days clearly stated that it's ready to start again. And South Korea, I think that it wants to start inter-Korean cooperation too. So I don't think that the regime has to be convinced. I think that they can manage it right now. Some degree of economic cooperation without destabilizing the regime.
We've hit you. Oh, one last question.
Ki-Hoon Lee from the World Bank. I think that if they open the economy, then multi-billion dollars investment will go to the North Korea. And then the Trump told that the United States will not spend anything. So some from the private investment, but a lot of them will be the international organization like World Bank and IMF. And then North Korea and Cuba are only two big countries as member of United Nations, but not World Bank and IMF. But the prerequisite of the World Bank IMF is the transparent, the economic information like unemployment, inflation, something like that, and the transparent government expenditure. Do you think North Korea will agree with the precondition of the World Bank and IMF membership?
No, I don't think so. I don't think they
Very
will
easy.
agree to that. And maybe they will find other sources. I mean, when you mentioned the World Bank, the first thing I thought about is the AIIB. And China already started to talk about including North Korea into the project of the One Belt One Road and all the investments of the AIIB. So I don't know, maybe they will find some other sources in case they start to open up and cooperate. They can find other international sources, but I don't think they will agree, not in the short term, to these kinds of preconditions to access.
We've hit you pretty hard on the economic security side of things. So before we wrap up, I want to switch it a little bit to focus on the legitimacy side, the ideological legitimacy side. And in your paper, you had focused on giving the North Koreans some space to change the ideology of the legitimacy of the regime based on the negotiations that we do with them on the nuclear program. But is there anything that we can do other than that outside of it? I know the U.S. and the South Korea relationship is sort of viewed in North Korea as making South Korea as a puppet state of the United States or something like that. Is there something that we can do to sort of lessen the leverage that they have in terms of the ideological fervor that they use against the United States to make it sort of seem like we're not the bad guy or the South Koreans aren't the bad guy, to help them switch around their ideas a bit?
Yeah, I mean, at USC, at the KSI, we have a thing called like video series, something like that, where they invite experts and they give their opinion about things. And last year there was a very interesting one with Professor Bridget Coggins from UC Santa Barbara. And her point was, what if the United States tomorrow open an embassy in Pyongyang? That will change the thing, also for the domestic legitimacy side of the things, because you based your propaganda a lot, not totally, but you base a lot of your propaganda on this enmity with the United States, on this revolutionary struggle against imperialism that flew from Japan and then became the United States. Okay, so North Korea is a revolutionary state. But what if the U.S. open an embassy in Pyongyang? Then they have to change this kind of domestic legitimacy approach. So, of course, Professor Coggins was provocative. And this is not a real option. But I think that it's better to just give them breathing space because the regime, in a way that the regime doesn't feel threatened. In one of the frameworks to study trust in IR, it's a very difficult concept to introduce in IR, trust me, but in one of the most relevant framework, one of the point is that to build trust, you have to leave some space, some operating space to the parties, because they have to adjust domestically to what's going on. And I think that's like very important thing when we talk about North Korea and the US.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but please join me in thanking Dr. Milani for his excellent presentation, as well as his deftly answer our tough questions.